Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I will show you the sweater I'm knitting with yarn that I dyed, and then I will update you on my Tour de Fleece spinning progress. So let's get started. Tour de Fleece started this past Saturday. What is that, June 29th, I think the date was. And in our local area, there's a yarn shop in Stillwater, which is about 30 miles east of where I live in Minneapolis. It's right on the St. Croix River, which was the dividing line between Minnesota and Wisconsin. It's a cute little town, and there's a shop there called Darn Knit Anyway. And they have this, what they call Maker's Lounge. It's this huge space with, there's a fireplace that you can have on in the winter, and there's tables and comfy chairs. People can just go there and hang out casually. They have a little patio outside, even. They're right on the river. It's a really nice spot. And so they were hosting a kickoff for Tour de Fleece. So my friend Elizabeth and I went there, and my friend Melanie met us there. And it was really fun. There were just so many spinners there. And at one point I got up and I just wanted to go around and see all the different spinning wheels, because I brought my e-spinner, Elizabeth brought her e-spinner, Melanie has a Louette S7E15. There were other people. Somebody was with a shacked matchless in our little circle. And then there was a bunch of people with e-spinners. But I just went around, and every single person with a standard wheel, not an e-spinner, nobody had the same wheel. And I saw so many wheels that I'd never seen before, especially, I mean, this is the kind of thing where if you have a travel wheel, like a lot of spinners have more than one wheel, and so they have something that will fold up easily. I saw some really cool little wheels that were very transportable. A lot of people with e-spinners, most of them had the dreaming robots. I think there was one person with a nano, but a lot of people had electric eels, different versions of them. My friend Elizabeth had a Daedalus Martin that is in a case. I had my Hanson. I don't know if there's anything else, but it was really interesting just to see the variety of wheels and hear, people love to talk about their wheels and explain about it. So that was really fun. So my goals for Tour de Fleece first was to finish spinning this Norwegian heritage breed wool. I had it in 3 different colors. I had a light gray, a medium, and a dark. I'd spun and plied the light gray already. I had shown that to you guys. When Tour de Fleece started, I had spun the medium gray but hadn't plied it, and then I was just getting started with the dark. So the first couple of days I spun up the dark, and then I plied and finished the medium and the dark, and then I will show you in the overhead what that looks like. I'm really happy with those yarns. My first goal for Tour de Fleece was to finish spinning this Trøndersau. So this is the Grå Trønder, I don't know how you'd pronounce it. I say Trøndersau, I'm sure it's wrong. It's a Norwegian heritage breed. So it was originally the land race sheep, which is like the sheep that were first brought to Norway when people got to Norway, crossed with the, it's now extinct Tautra sheep that was from an island. And they think that maybe that had been originally merino. It was some kind of a fine wool. So this had a pretty short staple, and they came from different parts of the sheep. So I talked about this one last time. This one had a lot of dandruff in it that fell out. So it's like from the back of the sheep. The medium one, I don't know if it's from the sides, and I'm not saying these are all from the same sheep. That's the same breed. Or maybe it's just a different sheep that had a slightly darker gray. I don't know. This one had a little bit more just VM, vegetable matter, in it. This one had the most, like, sometimes little bits of poop and all kinds of stuff, because this is the part, like, this is the color of their belly. So it was, closest to the ground. It had more junk in it. It also was kind of springer. It just had a different crimp to it than these two. And again, I don't know if that's because it's from the part of the sheep that it's from, or if it's just that particular sheep and that these are all from different sheep. I don't know. So I started out with 100 grams of fiber for each of these. I lost about 25% of that in the drum carder because they were really varied in length and there were a lot of little second cuts. And so because the shorter it is, the more likely it gets caught in the drum carder. Like that BFL, like almost nothing gets left in the carder because it's such a long staple. So I have about 75 grams of each of these. This is about a sport weight yarn. I'm really happy with these and the color. So this is so much yarn. This is 225 grams. Is that right? Yeah, 225 grams. So I'm trying to figure out what to do with this. I did find a shawl pattern. I will put it on this screen. I don't wear a lot of shawls, but this could be one that would be interesting to knit, and potentially I might decide to wear it at some point. And she mentioned specifically that it's good for hand spun yarn. Your little bits, you can make the leaves from little bits of color. It could be that at some point I will spin a cream color yarn to the same yarn weight and use that as the background and use these for the leaves. Maybe I will dye some of these, you know, as well as keep them in their natural colors. I don't know. So I am thinking about this shawl pattern, and then I'm thinking about how to incorporate these into that shawl pattern because I think it would be really interesting. I'm really happy with this yarn. It's a 2-ply yarn. Really happy with it. I just love the 3 colors. I think they're just gorgeous. The main thing that I wanted to work on spinning was this fleece I have that's a BFL, blue-faced Leicester, Romney cross. So the sheep had one grandparent that was a Romney, otherwise it's BFL. And I bought the fleece a number of years ago, scoured it last summer, and of the 3 scoured fleeces that I had, it was the one I was really wanting to spin most. And I am not so skilled of a spinner or experienced of a spinner that I know what I can get from a yarn or that I can control it that much. I usually sit down and just see what's going to happen with the spinning, and then I don't try to control it and make it do something different. I just spin it the way it seems like it wants to be spun and see what I end up with. And that's been the tricky part about spinning for me, is that for my knitting projects, I usually start with my project in mind and figure out what I want to knit and what kind of elements it's going to have, and eventually then what kind of yarn do I need to do that. And the answer is usually a worsted weight, a wool in a solid color, probably worsted spun, that's just like your basic yarns, because I'm thinking about the techniques and the construction method and the stitch patterns, and that's the interesting part to me. And in many ways the yarn is the least interesting or least important. It's like what yarn serves that purpose. But with spinning, you're going in the opposite direction. You're starting with the yarn. And so, you know, I was really lucky with my previous spin that I started last year, the sweater that I knit with my first hand spun sweater. I was able to get the yarn that I'd been looking for, and because of that, I bought more of that wool so that I could make a sweater's quantity. It was like, oh, I finally got the kind of yarn that I want. Now I'm going to get more of this wool. So in this case, I have a lot of this wool, and I need to see what kind of yarn I'm going to get with it. So I'll show you that in the overhead too. It wasn't what I expected, and so what I'm spinning toward, like, and the amount of yarn I need for that is not what I was originally expecting. And so let me go to the overhead and I'll show you what that yarn looks like. The main spin that I will be doing for Tour de Fleece is this wool here, which is a 3/4 BFL, blue-faced Leicester, 1/4 Romney. So this all came from one sheep. It's not like I'm blending them together. The sheep is 3/4 BFL and 1/4 Romney. I bought the fleece. It was a raw fleece I bought maybe 5 years ago at Shepherd's Harvest, our local fiber festival. And then last summer for Tour de Fleece, I actually scoured it. I had a few raw fleeces that I scoured, really figured out my process for that. So this is what that fleece looks like. I am pretty sure that she covers her sheep, with a coat so that they don't get super dirty, because there is just no VM, vegetable matter, no dirt. Like, they're well skirted fleece and really clean. It's in terms of dirt and other things in it. So this is what it starts out as, and then I card it and it ends up this fluffiness right here. And then this is the sample that I spun. I am spinning this on my Hanson mini spinner, and I usually have an idea of what it is I want, or that I'm thinking of I want, but that doesn't mean that that's what the yarn's going to end up being. So I have tons of this. Well, I had, the fleece was 4 pounds, and I probably have about 3 pounds once it was scoured, because it loses some, from the lanolin and the sweat and all that kind of stuff. Plenty to make a sweater, probably enough to make a couple sweaters. And so my goal was to spin a sweater quantity of this wool. And I typically like, somewhere around a DK or worsted weight yarn to knit with. I didn't know, what I would end up with, because some wools just naturally, the way I spin, naturally spin finer, and some spin thicker. So the finer the wool, the finer you can typically spin it. And this is pretty fine. The staple length on this, if you don't pull it, if you just let it be itself, is maybe 4 inches. But if you stretch it out, it's 7 inches. So I was thinking that I probably couldn't use the long draw with this. I mean, you could, there's things you can do. It's not that you can't, but based on my skill levels, I tried just seeing if I could use this carded wool and do long draw, and I was like, oh, I don't have, no, this isn't going to work for me. So I'm using, this is a sort of woolen preparation. It's carded, but I'm using a worsted drafting method, so short forward draw. And I got very slim singles. So if you look on this card, when I laid my singles on here, it was in this one that says 40, and I could still see a little bit of brown on either sides, but it was very close to being 40. And the yarn that I ended up with fits in here. I have it marked F for fingering weight. That's where it is right here, this fingering weight. And of course, fingering weight spans a lot of thicknesses. If we compare it to the kind of sock yarn that I typically knit with, like German sock yarn, it's, it's pretty comparable to something like that. The difference is in how much this weighs per yard. So this is just my little sample, and I would get 275 yards in 100 grams. Something like this has more like 460 yards in 100 grams, and that's because it's commercially done, and it tends to be, they can just get more yardage in their preparations. Hand spun yarn tends to be denser. This feels nice. It still has some spring to it. And so I was thinking, well, it's going to be a lot of yarn to do a sweater, but I'm thinking now, maybe I'll just make enough to make some socks and dye this and turn this into a pair of socks instead of a sweater. I don't know. And then maybe see if I can find a way to spin thicker yarn, like get better control of it so I can do like a worsted weight sweater with this. But this is my main spin, is this BFL Romney cross, and I'm going to be spinning a fingering weight. And this is 3-ply. This is not 2-ply. I like a 3-ply yarn. So this is a 3-ply fingering weight yarn. It seems less daunting to knit a pair of socks quantity with this yarn than it does to think about doing this for a whole sweater. So that's my plan for the BFL Romney. Tour de Fleece has 2 challenge days. So the first one will be this Sunday, which is what, July 7th. And then the next one will be Sunday, July 14th. And then there's a rest day after that. So in the Tour de France, that's usually a challenge day for the cyclists where they have to like cycle up some huge mountain and then they get a rest day. So my challenge goals are to use my e-spinner with the quill attachment and see if I can do the long draw using the quill. And so I'm going to use, I have leftover WAM, which is wool alpaca merino blend that I use for my hand spun sweater that I finished knitting, I don't know, a month or so ago. I have a couple of braids left over, so I know that I can get the kind of yarn that I like from that. And so doing long draw just on my regular wheel, what I want to see if I can do is spin long draw with the quill and get a similar result. Like, can I get that? Can I get good enough at it that I can really know what I'm doing and control my spin, knowing what's possible with that wool. So that's how Tour de Fleece is going so far. It's fun. I'm having a good time. Past couple of weeks, I have been working on dyeing some yarn so that I could knit a sweater. I got the yarn. It's a Brooklyn Tweed Quarry, which is a woolen spun bulky weight yarn. And the way the yarn is constructed is that it has 3 strands of unspun roving. And so that's like what the carding machines and everything, they spit out this little roving, and then you could spin that into a single and then ply the singles together to make a plied yarn. But that's not what they did with this yarn. They just took these 3 unspun strands of roving and then they lightly twisted them together so that they have a Z twist to them. So the angle of the twist, if you look at it, is going this way, where most commercial yarns have an angle that way, because singles are typically spun with a Z twist, and then when you ply them together, you would add an S twist to balance the yarn out. That's not what it is. So singles, if you get a single, it's usually Z spun, and that's what this is. So it's sort of acting like a single. It looks a lot like a single, but there's actually 3 separate strands of unspun roving connected together. And because it's woolen spun, it's got a lot of air in it, which means the more air that is in the yarn, the less wool is in it per yard. So instead of like 109 yards in 100 grams, this has got 200 yards in 100 grams. So that means that you can make a sweater and have it weigh about half as much as it would weigh if it was a worsted spun and plied bulky weight yarn. So that's really nice. The pattern I chose is also a Brooklyn Tweed pattern. It's called Bellows. It's like 10 years old. It was designed by Michele Wang. So a friend of mine said they don't think she's designing anymore. And the pattern actually called for 2 strands of Shelter, which is a different woolen spun yarn from Brooklyn Tweed. It's a worsted weight. So you put the 2 worsted weight strands together and you get a bulky weight. So I just started with the bulky weight yarn. But otherwise, the qualities of the yarn are going to be very similar. It's going to have the actual weight is going to be similar, which is a lightweight yarn, which is good when you're using a thick yarn, that it's not heavy, so it's not like dragging down and the force of gravity isn't causing it to stretch out a lot. So what I liked about this cardigan is, first of all, I love cardigans. Secondly, it's got a shawl collar. Love me a shawl collar. And I kind of like the way this shawl collar seems to be designed. We'll see what I think. And it's got a couple of cables in it. It's got texture. So it's got all of the things that I like in a sweater without me having to design it. I did some swatching. You know, they say, you know, somewhere between a US 10.5 and US 11 needle. And, you know, I understand that our needle sizes are weird. A US 10.5 is 6.5 millimeters. A US 11 is 8 millimeters. That's a huge jump in there. But you can get other needles in a 7 millimeter and 7.5 millimeter from ChalGoo. Is a company that they really do everything for all knitters. They have every kind of A circular needle, you can get it fixed or interchangeable. They have every size. They have everything. So I happen to have a couple of needles, ChiaoGoo needles, in these weird sizes. So a 7mm, which is a US 10 3/4, and I also have a 7.5mm, which is a US 10 7/8. So really silly, but so I'm using a 7.5mm needle to get the correct gauge. So I did some swatching. She has, it's knit bottom up flat in pieces, which I'm absolutely fine with. She calls for working the selvages in garter stitch. And I questioned about whether or not I actually wanted to do that, because garter stitch selvages, when you see me using mattress stitch, tend to almost have this, well, they have this bump that comes out on the back. And I'm like, is that going to be bigger or the same as if I have a whole stockinette selvage, ridge on the inside? So I did some swatching and I thought, maybe it'll be okay. We'll see. It looks like it's going to be okay. I won't be seaming with this thick yarn. I'll be seaming with like a fingering weight yarn or something like that, maybe a sock yarn, just to keep the bulk of the seams down. So I did a lot of swatching and I started it on Sunday. I already have both fronts done in one sleeve. The reason I didn't start with the back is because the needle that I happen to have on hand, the ChiaoGoo needle, is only is one of the few 24-inch needles I had. I thought, when am I ever going to need this needle size again? And the reason I bought it was to knit hats that I was experimenting with. And so I got 24 inches. And that's wide enough to do one of the fronts or the sleeve. But it's kind of short to do the back. The back isn't 24 inches wide. Just to bend a 24-inch needle in half in order to knit across, I just wanted something longer. And for whatever reason, ChiaoGoo takes forever to ship. So I'm not going to have the longer needle until next week sometime. So I've been knitting all the smaller pieces. But I was surprised that I was only 40% of the way done, having both fronts and a sleeve done. And that is because it's a cardigan, but it isn't just a cardigan. It's a cardigan with a shawl collar. And so those always take up more yarn than you would expect. I usually think of a normal cardigan with just, regular like crew neck or something like that and a button band. That might be 10% of the total amount of stitches and yarn that you're going to be using. In this case, because I did a spreadsheet, because I always do a spreadsheet, the collar and the band is going to be 16.6% of the sweater, which is more than one of the sleeves. So that's why I'm only 40% of the way. And it's a V-neck because it's a shawl collar, so you lose some of the stitches that you will have in the back. So there's a good reason, but it's always a surprise when I look at something like, I'm halfway done. No, I'm not halfway done. I will show you what I've got done on that sweater in just a bit. First, I want to tell you about the process I used to dye the yarn, because while this was a lovely shade they call pumice, light gray with little black speckles, I have 4 gray sweaters. And I just finished knitting a gray sweater, and I kind of I don't want to knit another gray sweater. I want something with some color in it. I ordered some yarn. It was a color suggested by one of my viewers when I was talking about I was going to dye this yarn. It's called Berry Crush, and it's a color I really like. When I finished dyeing it, I was like, wow, that they're going to see me walking down the street in that. It is bright, but then I start thinking about it, and I'm like, I have another bulky weight sweater. It's a turtleneck with cables on it that's practically the same color, and I also have another shawl collar cardigan that's very similar to this color. I don't know why my reaction to that color at first was like, oh my God, this isn't what I expected. I wish I still had the gray. This sweater would be more suitable for gray. I'm like, no, I didn't want a gray, and this is going to be fine. I'm not looking to change it. I'm not looking for advice on, how to tone it down. I actually quite like it now. It's just at first it's like, oh, wow, is this what I wanted? I think so. I think it is. So the process to dye this was tricky because it's a sweater quantity. It's not just a sweater quantity, it's a very fluffy sweater quantity because it's woolen spun. So it's 600 total grams. And I was like, what am I going to dye it in so that I can dye it all at one time and it will all end up the same color? The way I have dyed things in the past has been in this dye pot. It's a 12 quart, 3 US gallons. So 12 quarts, it's close to 12 liters. 12 quart pot. And if I'm dyeing smaller quantities, I will dye things in big mason jars, and I can put the mason jars in the dye bath. But if I'm dyeing, a whole skein or something, a couple of skeins, I will just have them floating around in the dye bath. And this is on the stove. It's heat. But this was like a lot of yarn and very fluffy. And I'm like, I don't even think it will all fit in the pot. Never mind also, yes, if there's water in there, then it will soak into that. But I just felt like it was so fluffy. But I found a video by ChemKnit. So I follow her on YouTube. She has a PhD in chemistry, and she does a lot of really interesting experiments with dyeing. And she did an experiment that she called Cool That Immersion dyeing. 600 grams. So she was dyeing 600 grams, and she was dyeing it in the exact same pot that I have. And the reason I have this pot is because I saw she had it and I really liked it, and I got one like the one that she has. But there are quite a few differences in her yarn compared to mine. She was working with a superwash. I think it was 80% wool, 20% nylon, superwash wool. So superwash, mine's not superwash. She's got 4 skeins of fingering and 2 of DK. So probably more yardage, a lot more yardage than I have, but much thinner yarn. And it was constructed differently. It was worsted spun yarn. So smoother, denser yarn and superwash on top of it. So there's just a lot of differences, but I thought if the fiber weighs the same, maybe it'll behave the same. And so I used her process. She started out with a gallon of water out of the 3 that the pot could hold. A gallon of water. She put the 6 skeins in there to let them soak, to kind of see how they would do. Was there going to be enough room? And to get all the air out, just to saturate the skeins. And then she added another gallon in there. So there's 2 gallons in the 3-gallon pot plus the 600 grams. And she could swirl them around. She goes, oh, there's going to be enough room. Now, she had done this kind of Cool That immersion previously in a 5-gallon painter's bucket, but that's plastic. And she was going to be doing this in the stainless steel thing, which she could then heat later on the stove. So that was the appeal to me, was that it would stay in the pot and then you could take it to the stove eventually. So the idea of this Cool That immersion is that you're dyeing slowly, and this is going to give the yarn more time to absorb it more evenly. And this could especially be an issue with superwash wool, which is what she's working with, because that takes on dye very quickly. And so if you don't want it to strike really quickly, you want to do some things to allow it to absorb more slowly. And so one of the things was to put the dye in the water and let it sit in the water for a while, absorbing dye before you added the acid, because the acid is going to make it want to take it faster. And especially with superwash, it's going to want to go faster. Again, I didn't have superwash, but I still wanted to use her procedure because I didn't know how to deviate from it and know if I was going to turn out okay. The problem I had was I put the first gallon of water in there and I lowered my 6 skeins of very fluffy yarn into it, and it just sucked it all up, and then half of the skein, of all 6 skeins was completely bone dry. They're just still taking up a lot of room. And I thought, I'm going to need a bigger boat. So I went and got the 5-gallon bucket. I watched her videos on how she had done things in the 5-gallon bucket just to get a sense. And I could do some of what she did, and I couldn't do some of the other things. But I got the 5-gallon bucket. I needed close to 3 gallons of water for my 6 skeins in order for there to be room for them to move around in the bucket at all. And so in order to add the dye, you take the skeins out, you squeeze out quite a bit of water, put them to the side, you add your dye in there, stir it all around. You know, the dye is dissolved in some hot water, and then it's added to the water in the bucket. And then, because you've squeezed out quite a bit of water from the skeins, then there's room for it to take up dye water. And so put the skeins back in, swirled them around. I did what she did, which was waited a half hour, an hour, added some vinegar, and then another hour, added some more vinegar, and then let it sit. She was anticipating needing it to be 12 to 24 hours, but after 6 hours, her dye bath was exhausted. Mine was not. And so I let it go 24 hours, and then 48 hours, and then 72 hours. So when I did watch her videos on the cold vat immersion in the bucket, she was putting her bucket outside so that it could get some solar heat, and so that the heat would help it a little bit. Even though it was June here and the sun was at its highest, we had the whole week it was raining there, and it was colder outside than it was inside the house. So I couldn't have done anything to improve that process. What she did with hers, because she had it in the pot, was just put it on the stove. What she had done with the 5-gallon paint bucket, plastic paint bucket, was that she had steam set it. So she would take the skeins and steam set it, but she wasn't doing the huge quantity of yarn in those, I don't think, that she was doing in the stainless steel pot. So I needed to figure out a way that I could heat those and make sure that the dye was even. So I do have a second pot. It's an enamel canning pot that I used to use for dyeing, except that it's so dark you can't see what color the water is. I had those two, so I weighed the two pots to make sure I knew what the difference of the pot weight was. Took the dyed skeins out, squeezed out the dye water as much as I could, and put 3 skeins in each, weighed them again, and then added dye water to the one, you know, to even them out in terms of how much the yarn and actually weighed. And then the remaining dye water I divided evenly between the two pots. So I had 2 pots, each with 3 skeins in them. They had absorbed quite a bit of dye over the 3 days, but there was still a lot of dye in the water. So I heated them up, let them be just below simmering for, I don't know, half an hour or so. I thought the water was exhausted. Let them cool down all afternoon. And then when I took them out, the water was still a little bit pink in both of them, but the yarn was much darker. You know, I'd really absorbed most of the dye, and so I was satisfied with that. Wasn't sure if I loved the color. It's grown on me, and I realized I have 2 other sweaters that are in that same color part of the spectrum, and I wear them happily in the winter. So let's go to the overhead. I'll show you what the yarn looked like after it had been dyed, and then what it looks like so far in the sweater. So this is the result. It is a bright color, and the color that you're seeing on your screen is unlikely to be the color that is reality. That's just the way it works with photography and monitors and particular colors. My monitor is showing it pretty close to reality. It may not be what you end up seeing. So what I like about this is that the little flecks of dark that were originally in the yarn, you can still see that, so that gives it a little bit of dimension to the color. One of the things that kind of surprised me was when I pulled the skeins out, I had these loops like this, these Tyvek kind of loops around the yarn, so that I would have something to pull up that would be strong, that I could pull up, you know, in order to swirl things around and check on what was going on. I kept those at the top so I could grab them, and so the part of the skein that was sitting on the bottom of the bucket tended to get a little bit of some of this other, you can see that here. You see how it's a kind of a different color. So it turned it into more of a semi-solid or tonal. So there's a little bit extra colors. There's a little bit of some resist underneath where the yarn was tied for the figure 8. It's a little bit lighter under there, but it had a long time in the bath. And so these little differences don't show up as flashing or pooling or look terrible in any way in the knitted fabric. But I did think that that was interesting. I don't know if there was still some sediment in the dye, like maybe it wasn't fully dissolved. I don't know. And if it sank down and so this part of the yarn just sat in that, or I don't know. I don't know what would have caused it. If anybody has any ideas, I'd love to hear it. Let me show you what it looks like in the knitted fabric. So you can see a little bit of some of those little blips of color here and there. They show up. So it's a little bit, on camera it almost looks more like there's more variation in color than it does in real life. There's a little bit, like here's a little bit lighter, but they are consistent from one skein to another. This is the left front. I knit this one first. This is the right front, and somewhere in here I switched to another skein, but it was, I don't know, somewhere in here I switched, and I don't know where. There's no like dividing line. There's no difference there. And this is the first sleeve. You can see some of that pink here and there. This particular skein had a little bit more of that, of the redder bits showing in here, but it's still the same, you know, it's still the same color as the other ones. It's all working out really well. So this has been a fun experiment. I really like learning more about dyeing, especially since, you know, with the spinning, I love the natural colors of wools, but I don't necessarily always want to have a gray sweater or a gray whatever. And so I'm really enjoying learning more about dyeing and how I can use those natural colors as a base for the dye on top of it. So it's been fun. I'm having a lot of fun with this. In case you missed this, in my YouTube community post, Instagram post, Ravelry group post, or on Ko-fi, the next episode of Casual Friday in 2 weeks, it will be my 300th Casual Friday. I have more than 600 videos on my channel, but 299 so far are Casual Fridays. The rest are technique videos. So if you have any questions about me or the channel or whatever, you can let me know down in the comments below, and I will see if I can answer those for you in the next Casual Friday. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.